Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. Today, we got a doozy, kind of some new information that is very similar to what we learned about last year as sophomores, the home front for the United States during World War One. It's a little similar to World War Two. However, more of obviously World War One. So let's get into it. Let's hold on. Do 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 do. All right. The home front and my head is uniquely blocking my ceiling fan light, so it doesn't look like I'm video recording from heaven. Does it do that? See? Whoop, whoop. Oh. All right, the home front, chapter 6, lesson 2. We got 40 slides to get through. And yes, half of them are pictures, so don't worry. All right, that was your warm up, page 258. Objectives, we're going to identify the impact women, African Americans, Mexican Americans had upon the workforce during World War I and changes in their roles once soldiers returned from war to their jobs. And we're going to describe how the United States created new agencies to mobilize the economy, draft soldiers, and build public support for the war. All right. Progressively building up the military. So don't forget that by the time the US declared war on Germany in 1917, the Progressive Party presidents were still in power, mainly Woodrow Wilson. Just because the war had begun didn't mean that progressives abandoned their ideas. They simply applied progressive ideas to fighting the war. So again, here are the big three progressive presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson. So organizing industry. So progressives emphasized on careful planning and scientific management to shape the federal government's approach to mobilizing the American war economy. To manage their relationship between the federal government and private companies, Congress created special boards. These boards emphasize cooperation between big business and government. Their goal is to ensure the most efficient, there's that word again, efficiency, efficient uses of natural resources to further the war effort. Got to make stuff. So one such board, the War Industries Board, test question. It's created July 1917. Its job was to coordinate the production of war materials. Woodrow Wilson was reluctant at first to give the War Industries Board authority over the economy, but in 1918, Woodrow Wilson felt that it needed more coordination. So Bernard Baruch, or whatever, put in charge. He was a stockbroker. So the War Industries Board told manufacturers what to produce. They also controlled the flow of raw materials, ordered construction of new factories, and occasionally set prices. Of course, the president's approval. Excuse me. Food and fuel. So you have the Food Administration and the Fuel Administration during this time period. The Food Administration was its most successful, ran by future President Herbert Hoover. And it was responsible for increasing food production while reducing civilian consumption because we are a consumer society. But instead of rationing, Hoover encouraged Americans to save on their own. Hoover encouraged Americans to grow victory gardens to raise their own vegetables, leaving the rest for the troops. And you wouldn't believe it, but you could be, quote, un-American if you did not make your own victory garden. If you were out buying, over purchasing, think of going to Costco and buying everything for your family. At this time period, people would look at you funny. So leave the rest for the troops. You don't need all that food. Just get enough for yourself for the week, and that's all you need. You'll need all this luxurious cheeses and charcuterie boards, none of that stuff. You also have the Fuel Administration, and that was to manage the nation's use of coal and oil in order to conserve energy. The United States also introduced the daylight savings time and shortened work weeks for factories that didn't make war materials because they don't need to be open if they're not making stuff for the war. So bye, Felicia. All right, government got 5 on it. So how will the war be paid for? Well, by the end of the war, the U.S. will spend about $44 million a day. That's going to total around $32 billion total. So to fund the war, because again, wars cost money, Congress raised income tax rates, placed new taxes on corporate profits, and a tax on profits of arms factories, because they're the ones making all the deals at this time, arms. To raise more money, the government borrowed $20 million by selling Liberty and Victory bonds. And by buying bonds, Americans loaned the government their money, in which the government agreed to repay with interest after some years. So if I don't know if bonds are still around. Obviously, they're still around. But if your family has a bond from, say, World War II, maybe even the Vietnam War, those are probably worth some money. You could cash it in. I think they might have an expiration date, though. So don't quote me on that. So here's how you sold Liberty bonds: through propaganda. Beat back the Hun with Liberty bonds. What's that say? If you can't enlist, invest. Buy a Liberty bond. Defend your country with your dollars. Fight or buy bonds. Third Liberty loan. To strike or not to strike. So government officials knew that they needed cooperation by workers if mobilization, getting ready for the war, was going to succeed. So to prevent strikes from occurring, they will set up the National War Labor Board in 1918. They will attempt to mediate labor disputes that might have otherwise led to strikes. So the National War Labor Board frequently pressured industry to grant concessions to workers, frequently such as wage increases, 8-hour workdays, and the rights of unions to organize and bargain collectively. In exchange, labor leaders agreed not to disrupt war production with strikes. So it's not like it was forbidden. However, again, here's that selfish, un-American idea that if you're selfish enough to strike, maybe you should have enlisted in the first place, bud. So people would look down on others for various reasons that, if you're out here trying to strike and get better pay, but there's a war going on, like, what are you complaining about? I know. Women stuff. Hey, women, we get to talk about you early on. War increased employment opportunities for women. They filled the industrial jobs vacated by men and also serving in the military, or by men. They were filled. I can't speak. Women filled the industrial jobs vacated by the men serving in the military, shipping, manufacturing, railroad industries. Jobs weren't permanent, though. Changes that led to them being employed demonstrated that women were capable of holding jobs that many believed only men could do. So here's some women finishing some artillery. I believe that is coal they are moving. All right, Great Migration. Test question. So fewer immigrants in America because, Chinese Exclusion Act, all that stuff, the Quota Acts, left job openings for African Americans. So wartime jobs and high wages drew African Americans to factories, producing war materials. Promises of high wages and plentiful work convinced between 300 and 500,000 African Americans to move north. They left the South to move to the industrial North. Again, that is called the Great Migration. So cities' racial makeup like Chicago, New York, Cleveland, and Detroit will change greatly. And eventually politics in the North too changed, as African Americans would soon be able to vote in this time period. And here's a picture of the Great Migration. There are two Great Migrations. If you can't tell, this is a very pixelated picture. But the green arrows going up are mainly from the first Great Migration to, Chicago, Detroit. I think that's Pittsburgh, New York's up here, right? This lighter green is mainly for the second Great Migration, which happens, you guessed it, during World War II. So here are some African Americans packing their bags and leaving town. Mexican Americans. The war also encouraged other groups to migrate. Between 1917 and 1920, more than 100,000 Mexicans migrated into the Southwest, providing labor for farmers and ranchers. Mexican Americans also found new opportunities in factory jobs in many American cities. And like other immigrants before them, they too faced hostility and discrimination. Mexican Americans tended to settle in separate neighborhoods called barrios, where they could support one another. Don't make fun of my accent, please. If you know anything about Cheech and Chong, has nothing to do with World War One, but they have a song called Mexican Americans. So, and here are some Mexican Americans providing work, labor, public opinion. So progressives did not think that organizing the economy would be enough to ensure the success of the war effort. They also believed that the government needed to shape public opinion. Soon after the declaration of war, W.W. Woodrow Wilson created the Committee of Public Information, CPI, to, quote, sell the war to American people. Headed by a guy named George Creel, the CPI recruited advertising executives, artists, authors, songwriters, entertainers, public speakers, and motion picture companies to help sway public opinion in favor of the war. The CPI distributed pamphlets, and arranged thousands of, quote, 4-minute speeches to be delivered at movie theaters and other public places. Some 75,000 speakers, known as 4-minute men, urged audiences to support the war in various ways, from buying war bonds to reporting draft dodgers to the authorities. So here you have 4-minute men, Committee on Public Information, and then you have Pershing's Crusaders. Here are 4-minute men giving speeches. That's a lot of people. Again, 4-minute men are trying to sell the war so more Americans support it. So, civil liberties. Test question. So, the government restricted civil liberties by passing legislation to fight anti-war activities and enemies at home. So, you have the Espionage Act, established in 1917, established penalties and prison terms for those who gave aid to the enemy, gave false reports, or interfered with the war effort. And then the Sedition Act of 1918 expanded the meaning of the Espionage Act to make it illegal for any public expression of the opposition to war. So the government could now prosecute anyone who criticized the war. Despite protests, these acts were upheld by the Supreme Court. In the First Amendment, it stated, Congress shall make no law, abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. But the Supreme Court departed from such a strict interpretation of the Constitution. In the court case Schenck versus the United States, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the majority opinion that the government could restrict speech when that speech constituted a clear and present danger. So if the government felt that the words that were being said about the war in a negative manner, they could be prosecuted. So No real freedom of speech here, people. So here you have espionage bill. I'm guessing that's a whip. Congress is whipping liberty with the espionage bill. Don't talk. The web is spun for you with invisible threads. Keep out of it. Help to destroy it. Stop equals think. Ask yourself if what today you're about to say might help the enemy. Spies are listening. All right. Selective service. So when the U.S. entered World War I, the National Guard and the Army together held around 200,000 troops. For a war to occur on a global scale, such as this new war, they were going to need more bodies. Many progressives felt that conscription was against the democratic and Republican principles of the country. So Congress came up with the Selective Service Act of 1917, which required all men 21 to 30 to register. Then a lottery of randomly chosen men would come before a local draft board in charge of selecting or exempting people of service. The members of these draft boards were civilians from local communities, and they played an important role. Progressives believed that local people understanding community needs would know which men to draft to do and would do a far better job than a centralized government bureaucracy. So, around 2.8 million Americans were drafted into World War I. So, register for the war. Here's one of those pamphlets for telling 21 to 31. 21, can you do something for me? 21 to 31. 21 to 30-year-old man. I can't really speak. And here's the original Uncle Sam poster. I want you for the U.S. Army. Volunteers. So not all Americans in the military were drafted. Around 2 million more men were volunteers. Many had grown up to the stories about the Civil War or the Spanish-American War, and they saw it as a great adventure to see the world and explore it. Fun, fun, fun. Oh, but did they not know? And they're ready and willing to fight for the American cause. Before COVID, masks were in, people. If you didn't know, now you know. Although the horrors of war soon became apparent to the American troops, their morale remained high, helping to ensure victory. More than 50,000 soldiers will die, American. Over 200,000 soldiers would be wounded. 60,000 more soldiers died from disease or the famous influenza epidemic, the AKA the Spanish flu. This flu epidemic, however, was not limited to the battlefield. It soon spread around the world, and more than a quarter of all Americans were sick. This disease killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, including 500,000 Americans. And your boy did some research to this day, what I could do. And there are 7 million, put it in perspective. I know this flu was early on during 2020, 2021, would often be compared to the epidemic during or shortly following World War I. So around 25 to 50 million people died. So according to the COVID website, if you search up COVID19.gov or whatever, there have been around 7 million deaths reported as early as November 10th. So I know it's still a little bit behind, but that's as up to date as I can get it for you. So here's some masks. If I fail, he dies. That's a nurse. Those are nurses. Look at these masks. Where do I get one? And again, here's some military wearing masks. So African Americans in combat, of the nearly 400,000 African Americans who were drafted, 42,000 served in overseas combat. Again, this is at that time during legal segregation. African Americans encountered discrimination and prejudice in the Army, where they served under racially segregated units, almost always under supervision of white officers. But despite these challenges, many African American soldiers fought with distinction. The African American 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions fought in bitter battles along the Western Front. Many soldiers in those divisions won praise from the French commander Marshal Philippe Pétain and U.S. Commander General John J. Pershing. Here's a picture of African Americans lining up to fight. Again, here's some ready to take pictures. Other minorities helped too. Around 12,000 Native Americans and 20,000 Puerto Ricans served in the armed forces. Bet you didn't know that. Thousands of Mexican Americans also served in the war, volunteering for service more than any other minority group. Despite discrimination, many Asian immigrants fought on the side of the U.S. even before they were even considered citizens. Many Asians served in the U.S. Army with distinction and were granted citizenship in recognition of their contributions. Women. So World War I was the first war in which women officially served in the armed forces, although, let's get it, non-combat positions. As the military prepared for war in 1917, it faced a severe shortage of clerical workers because so many men were assigned to active duty. In 1917, for example, the Navy authorized the enlistment of women to meet their clerical needs. Women in the Navy wore a standard uniform and were assigned the rank of yeoman. More than 11,000 women served in the Navy by the end of the war. Other than clerical duties, other women served as radio operators, electricians, pharmacists, chemists, and photographers. But unlike the Navy, the Army refused to enlist women. Instead, they began hiring women as temporary employees to fill these clerical jobs. The only women to serve in the Army were the Army Nurse Corps. Women served as nurses in both the Army and Navy since the early 1900s, but as only auxiliaries, which means they weren't assigned ranks and technically were not enlisted. More than 20,000 nurses, however, served in the Army Nurse Corps during the war, including more than 10,000, over half, served overseas. And here are some women in the Navy. I want you for the Navy. Promotion for anyone enlisting, apply any recruiting station or postmaster. You are needed now to join the Army Nurse Corps. All right, that concludes this lecture. It was a little bit longer, but at the same time, so much good stuff. I bet there are some things even you didn't even know. So, we'll see. Hopefully you guys did enjoy that. If you did, wait, whoa, why am I doing the outro? Your homework is to do page 261, 2 through 4. Page 261, 2 through 4. So there we have that. All right, now we can do the outro. If you guys enjoyed that, please make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.